Hi, everyone. As introduced, my name is Norbert de Langen. I'm a full-time open source maintainer, and the thing that I'm maintaining is Storybook. So today I'm going to be talking about Storybook, but I want to start out with why and what made it come to be for me to personally need it at some point and then later start maintaining it. And so reason number one really is a pretty depressing message. It's that writing apps is hard. I find it hard. If you doubt that writing apps is hard, ask yourself how often are your software estimations correct? Are you off by an hour, a day, a week, a month? I've been off by a month, at least more than once. So the de facto standard solution to this problem is split up your big application into smaller applications, right? That's the answer? Well, you do run into the risk of creating this distributed monolith. So you start out with this huge component that does all of your app, and you break it up into smaller pieces, but there's still magic there. There's still components needing each other to be there, and it can be quite hard. So I asked the question again, is decomposing your big application into smaller pieces the answer? Yeah, it's the answer. So thanks. That was a good short talk. All right. So seriously, I do full-time open source maintenance. I'm really proud of that. I think it's really cool to work in open source. I encourage anyone to work on open source either as a spare project or come help out with Storybook. I do software advocate, or I'm a software developer advocate for Chroma. That's kind of the formal title. Something I'm proud of, I'm a father and a husband of a daughter, 5 years old. And personally, I don't really have an idea of what I'm doing. I'm just going along with the flow. So I want to start up my real presentation about, I've been doing consulting for years, and this is a scenario that kind of came up. It's not an actual company, but sort of a hypothetical scenario that you might recognize. A company, they're building a software as a service, and their application is pretty big, so they've decided to make their UI split into 3 different teams. Team 1 is responsible for something like checkout, another is for the front homepage, another for whatever. It doesn't really matter. As time progresses, teams are kind of making requests to each other, like, hey, can you make this change to your code over there? That's kind of easier for me. And that kind of happens over and over. And it's taking time. And for the company, that's costing money. And it can get to the point, and I've seen this, where there's tensions between the teams because the use case that team A wants is not what team B really wants. And it's their component, so they get to decide what really goes in. And the team A is kind of unhappy. Now they have to fork it or copy it, and no one likes copying code. So what can we learn? What can we do? And how can we build our UIs to minimize this process? And I think the key concepts that I've kind of learned are abstraction, isolation, and autonomy. What we want to reach is all teams and all individuals to be autonomous, so they can make changes whatever they want, and they don't really need to change someone else's property. I think most software developers will know that a good abstraction is really the key to good software. If you create abstractions where you shouldn't, you get complexity. And if you don't create abstractions where you should, you get complexity also. And if developers are like ninjas or knights and they're fighting complexity, then complexity is the dragon that we're trying to slay. And I think is a funny synergy there, that if you fail to combat this dragon effectively, you're effectively feeding it and making the problem worse. Up to the point that the dragon is fed so much, it is so powerful, no single knight can ever defeat it. which is the concept technical debt. And it can reach to a certain degree that you basically file for bankruptcy. So to create correct abstractions, you must understand the problem well. And an abstraction is nothing else than a solution to a problem. And I think of a famous quote that's kind of in the theme of my talk about combat. The Art of War, Sun Tzu wrote that if you know your enemy and you know yourself, then you don't need to fear battle. But if you don't know yourself or you don't know the enemy, then you need to be fearful. And if you don't know either one, you're going to lose. So isolation is the possible result of good abstraction, or better worded, good isolation is the possible result of good abstraction. We all know probably that an isolated component, that's a component you can just swap out for another one, so it has a similar API. That's not really what isolation is about. It's really about the API of your component. Isolated pieces will have some sort of API for communication. And it's this API, in React terms, the props, that determine whether your component that you've created for your team or for some other team is going to be loved or despised. There's a trade-off in isolation, and I've seen many cases where a component just isolates too much. And this is really what drove me as a part of to give this talk, and it's something that I've learned over time, including maintaining Storybook. If your component isolates too much, your API will have to grow to compensate for its multitude in use cases. And that will increase the component's complexity. If your component does not abstract too much, and it doesn't isolate too much, and it has a nice API to do the things you want to do, then you get components that don't really have to change all this often. And when the components do change, you're not changing a component that has like 10 different use cases. Their use cases are limited, so they're simple. They may have state, they may be context aware, but they're simple because their number of use cases are limited. And therefore, because these components don't need to change that often, they're much safer to reuse because you don't really want to use a component that is isolating too much for a multitude of reasons, one of which they're going to be changing all the time because they're adding new use cases. You know this up front. And because they don't change, they're really safe because you don't have to ever update them. And that's when you get into this autonomous state. You can use a component and it's safe. It will not really change because it doesn't isolate too much. So React components, they abstract a section of UI, right? I think the React docs themselves mention as a slice of your UI. So sort of, I think I try to write my components not as like a visual slice of my UI, but as an abstraction on a UI pattern or concept. This is really different from a visible section of the UI. Now, these UI concepts can definitely be visible, otherwise you would not be presenting any pixels to the screen, right? But they can provide so much more to components lower down that are visible. They can provide data, they can provide state or layout, or they provide some styles. And a well-implemented UI concept should abstract and isolate only one concept. If you abstract too much, the users of your components are going to suffer. So here's a little example, and I'm kind of taking this example from Ken Dot, so I want to give him full credit on this component. I've tweaked it a little bit so it made my presentation more fit my preference. So this component, it's an accordion component. We've probably all written it once in our career, or multiple times maybe. Is this a good level of abstraction? Is this a good isolation? Raise your hands if you think this is the proper way to write an accordion component. So I think there's a problem with this, and that's it isolates too much. These items that I'm passing in, how are they displayed? What do they look like? Where does this purple or pink border coming from? Where's this plus and minus icon coming from? This isolates too much. And you can see the pattern and the problems increasing when you add new use cases. So another team member comes along and says, so my product owner, he really likes it if the content appears on top. Can you make it this way? I'm like, all right, I can do that. It's not hard. I'll just add a prop, and it's a Boolean value. If it's true, the content displays on top. If it's false, the content displays on the bottom. And you know, you guessed it. So someone else comes along and says, can you display the panel, the content on the right? I think that's going to be much prettier. Also, I kind of want these icons to appear as different icons, right? Okay, and then someone comes along and like it's just kind of get into this huge mess of all sorts of props. You're going to have to document all these props. And you're going to have to tell the user, like, okay, you should never use the content class name together with the open trigger because that will not work. And like, you don't want to do that. This is not all that great. So a way to combat it, like one of the ways you can combat these many props is to actually create what I call preset components. And these preset components, they are actually abstracting away a couple of props from some other component. So you're able to use the accordion component to just pass all the props to it, but you can also use the accordion bottom single component, and it basically abstracts away the bottom prop and the single prop. Now, I think this is an all right solution, but there's at least one problem with it. And it's one of the two hard things in computer science, naming things. How do you call this accordion bottom single component? I could not come up with a better name, and I tried. So design your component so it encapsulates a UI pattern, and no more, no less. Because if you abstract, and if you abstract correctly, you must understand the problem well. Now, where am I going with this? I actually want to show you an accordion component that I've implemented in about 3 lines of code. But first, I want to really think about, and this is something that I want to give you as a tip. When you're creating components, the first thing you should probably do is write down, maybe in your code as a comment, the purpose and the concept that this component is going to be abstracting or is going to be isolating. So I did that for my hypothetical accordion, and actually thought like, hey, this actually not just abstracts away accordions, but also tabs and carousels and many other patterns, and I can reuse that. So here's what I call my switcher component, and it takes just one prop, and that's the initial state. It's an array of ones and zeros because I'm lazy. I don't want to write false and true. Like, that's way too much typing. And then it takes a render prop. So who's familiar with render props? Cool. All right, so I'm going to explain it because there were less than 50% of fingers. So in React, you can pass in pass in children. You know this. You can have a div, and there's a span inside it. React actually supports any data that you can pass into as children. It can be a string. You've probably done this. But it can also be a function. Now, what happens if you pass in a function as a children? Well, React cannot render that. But your component, as being demonstrated by the presentation before me by Robert, a component has access to children as just another prop. And so what can happen, and I will show you when I show the implementation of the switcher component, is you can call your children as a function, and then you can pass in additional data. So this is a way for still single unified data flow, but it's from parent to child. And so that's what I'm doing. my switcher component has an initial state, and then it's going to be in control of the state. And it passes down, it calls the function that is children, and it's going to pass that function two values. The list of the current state, which is like an array of ones and zeros, and then a function that the children can call to change the state. It's sort of like a reducer if you're using Redux. What does this allow? Well, now I've completely separated the concept of switching the activity of items away from the items themselves. And so now anyone can use the switcher component to create their own carousel, or tabs, or accordion. So a new use case comes up with this new switcher component, which says, all right, so this one opens multiple tabs at the same time. And I can close them, and I can close all of them. Now someone comes along and says, okay, I want to make sure that at least one tab is open, they cannot close the last tab, and only one tab can be open. Now my previous component, the carousel component, actually had this ability, but it was built in and was abstracted away. So here's what you can do with the switcher component. And you can see what is actually happening is that the switcher component is not changing. And in fact, the item is not changing. Both of these components are completely stable. But what I've added is this one little helper function called set, which just uses the current state, and it uses the function to set the state, and then it passes this set function on click. And this is the implementation of my switcher component. Now granted, I'm using the useState hook because it's been more than 2 days, so we're free to use it. And I'm using children as a function. You can see this right here. So this is my switcher component. I'm destructuring my props. One of my props is children, and then I'm calling children with actives and set actives. So the key takeaway, encapsulate the UI pattern and no more and no less. And I want to give you one more example. And that's this layout component. And a layout component is something that I really like to write, because how much time do you spend writing your app, making sure that div 1 is actually next to div number 2, or above in certain situations? And this pattern repeats over and over again. But if you think about slicing your application as you're just presented with a mock design, you don't really think about this pattern. You just kind of go with the flow and create these same patterns over and over again. I think this is a great pattern to abstract into a component themselves and share. And so what I can do is actually isolate or abstract away the sort of media query in a component themselves. And I can show you that this component makes sure that the purple content and the blue content appear top to bottom on small screens and next to each other on big screens. Let me zoom. It's probably better. So embrace using components beyond the directly observable or visible. But you're going to run into a problem with this. And I think you know the solution, which is like what my presentation started out with, Storybook. So I can tell you that you've been looking at Storybook all this time, actually. What does Storybook do? Well, you have so many components, and at first, things are all right. You start out with your team, but a few months later, you don't really remember what components you created 2 months ago. And someone leaves your team and another team member comes along, and they don't really know what you've been doing for 2 months, have they? That's really hard. How do you know about this switcher component existing if you've never visited that one page that has the switcher component on it? You don't. You would create another switcher component because you might have some sort of convention of where to place files, but even that is something that you need to learn. So Storybook is like a catalog of all your components. And you can see it as sort of a workbench where you can take one component, look at it in isolation, play around with it, look at it in multiple media queries and all that stuff. You can document your components along with it. Is the size all right? Can I make it slightly smaller? All right. So my presentation itself, like when I was building my presentation, I created just a heading component, and then I had all sorts of styles for it. I had an avatar component and all sorts of sizes for it. I had this layout component, and I built it using Storybook because Storybook kind of sets up Webpack with how much of reloading for you, so you don't have to do all that in your app. As I mentioned, you can create pretty good documentation for Storybook. In version 5, we're going to be increasing how much you can do with this by the ability to interleave your own components with your documentation, as many people using either style guide dist or they want sort of more of a style guide is feel. And one of the cool features of Storybook is actually that we support all sorts of add-ons. And one of the cool add-ons that I think we're actually really proud of, I'll show you in this switcher component, which is also in Storybook. Put this one on the side. There we go. So I've got this carousel accordion component, and it's currently displaying the Dutch flag because I'm Dutch. But this Dutch flag apparently is not all that accessible. So here's an add-on for Storybook to test the accessibility of your component. It looks at your rendered HTML and runs a couple of libraries on it and determines like, okay, so these are the things that are wrong with it. So it turns out that the black text on red and the black text on blue are not accessible. If I change them, which I can using Storybook right here, I can make this deep sky blue. And I'll change it here as well. This kind of resembles the Israeli flag, which apparently is fully accessible. So as mentioned, you can add your own add-ons to Storybook. There's a whole bunch of add-ons that we support. In the new versions of Storybook, add-ons can appear in lots of places, so you can do really cool stuff with them. Storybook allows you to take snapshots of all of your stories, so you don't really have to make any snapshots manually anymore, if you're into snapshots, that is. And you can add integrations into Storybook. So I actually work for the company called Chroma, and they build this product called Chromatic. I think it's pretty cool, but obviously I'm biased. To explain what it does, if you have Storybook and you've documented all of your components, how cool would it be that if you make a commit, that a tool would run a screenshot, like literally visits your Storybook and takes a screenshot of your component, divs it with the previous time it's done that, and tell you whether something has changed. That's what Chromatic does. I used this myself before actually joining Chroma, and it actually made a huge impact in our team, allowing us to get not just code review, but actual like visual review from designers before merging our commits into master, which was huge. We actually got a good collaboration with our product owners, designers, and developers. So Storybook is open source. If you like something or don't like something in Storybook, you want to help, we're a really open and welcoming community. And this is really one of the key takeaways for Storybook. This is something that I really believe in. Storybook is a tool not just for React developers, but all UI developers and their team members. We're trying to build a tool for all of them, because Storybook supports React, React Native, Angular, Vue, and you name it. There's over like 10 different frameworks that we support. And the cool thing about it is that an Angular developer might need an add-on and create it, and it will work for React. How awesome is that? So I really want to thank this awesome, awesome community for being so awesome. And there's one guy, and there's one other maintainer right here. He's going to come up right on the stage right now. This guy is Igor, and I feel humbled by his presence. He does so much for the Storybook community. He's a really awesome guy. So it looks like I have about 20 seconds left, so I'm at my last slide. Thank you all for your time. My presentation you can find right there. So it's an actual Storybook that you can see how I implemented everything, all the add-ons that I've used. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me on Twitter. I actually like doing support. I actually really like it. Thank you.